The Painter, The Corporal, and the Cosmic Void, 1889 to 1919. The Hook, a $20 watercolor and the architect of genocide. Imagine a world where the most destructive man of the 20th century was simply a mediocre artist, a failed architect, and an awkward, intensely lonely young man who whistled tunes like Disney's Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. This isn't a dark comedy. It's the profound, chilling reality of Adolf Hitler's early life. The chasm between the small, petty failures of his youth and the colossal, horrifying scale of his later crimes is the most astonishing truth of his story. If a single professor at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts had said yes in 1907, the world might have been spared its greatest catastrophe. This is the origin story of the Führer, a story steeped in provincial failure, cultural paranoia, and the desperate yearning for a destiny that began not with an army, but with a failed $20 watercolor painting. The Austrian Drifter, Alois's Shadow, and Clara's Loss. Adolf Hitler was not born a German. He was born in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the German border, in 1889. His origins were messy, rural, and steeped in a family history of ambiguity that would later haunt his own racial obsession. His father, Alois Hitler, was an illegitimate child who, for the first decades of his life, bore his mother's surname Schicklgruber, before eventually legitimizing himself with the surname Hitler. Alois was a harsh, quick-tempered, mid-level customs official who dreamed of his son following him into the respectable civil service. Young Adolf, however, despised his father's structured bourgeois ambitions, viewing them as a stifling constraint on his true calling, art. This deep-seated tension drove a permanent wedge between father and son. Yet a strange, dark irony persists. Many historians suggest that Alois's severe, authoritarian parenting style may have provided the chilling template for the dominance and demand for absolute loyalty that Hitler would later impose on a nation. Alois died in 1903 when Adolf was 13, leaving the boy a small pension and even larger void. Adolf's true emotional anchor was his mother, Clara. She was a devout Catholic and the opposite of Alois, warm, doting, and fiercely protective. Her death from breast cancer in 1907, after a prolonged, agonizing illness, devastated the 18-year-old. He would later refer to this loss as the most terrible moment of his life. For a period, his mother's Jewish doctor, Edward Bloch, who had treated her with immense care, received rare expressions of gratitude from Hitler, including a handmade postcard. It is a moment of impossible cognitive dissonance. The future architect of the Holocaust expressed sincere thanks to a Jewish man for the kind of service he would later deny to millions. Vienna, the crucible of failure and ideology, 1909 to 1913. Armed with a meager inheritance and an unshakable belief in his artistic genius, Hitler moved to Vienna. This was the promised land, the glittering, cosmopolitan heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was also the place where his life would utterly collapse into poverty and his toxic ideology would begin to calcify. He applied twice, in 1907 and 1908, to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. The admission panel's assessment was brutal and definitive. He had no talent for painting. They suggested he might be better suited to architecture, a field for which he lacked the necessary secondary school qualifications. This rejection, for a man whose ego was already fragile and outsized, was catastrophic.
The inheritance money soon dried up. From 1909 to 1913, the future Führer was a social outcast, a genuine dropout, drifting through the lowest rungs of Viennese society. He sold small, technically mediocre watercolor paintings and postcards, mostly bland, repetitive scenes of city landmarks, to Jewish art dealers, the very people he would later demonize. He often slept in homeless shelters and lived for months in the Mannerheim, or men's hostel. It was in this wretched, isolated state that he immersed himself in the seething undercurrents of Viennese politics. Vienna was a breeding ground for extreme ethnic nationalism, anti-Slavic sentiment, and crucially, political anti-Semitism. He latched on to the fiery rhetoric of men like Mayor Karl Lueger, who mastered the populist art of using anti-Jewish sentiment to gain power, and the extreme pan-German nationalism of Georg von Schönrauer. These were the venomous seeds that took root in the mind of a lonely, resentful man desperately seeking a scapegoat for his personal failures and the perceived failure of the state. The core irony of his Vienna years is that his life as an artist was sustained by the enemy he claimed to hate, while his political awakening was a poor, self-justifying rationalization for a life that had completely failed to meet his own grand expectations. The Great War, baptism by fire, and the birth of a new man. In 1913, to avoid Austrian military conscription, claiming he was unfit to serve in the multi-ethnic Habsburg army, which he saw as impure, Hitler moved to Munich, Germany. However, when World War I broke out in August 1914, Hitler greeted the conflict with what he later called intoxicating enthusiasm. The war was a release, a grand collective purpose that instantly dissolved the bitter isolation of his Vienna years. Despite being an Austrian citizen, he successfully petitioned the King of Bavaria to be allowed to serve in the German army. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and served throughout the war as a Meldegänger, or dispatch runner, one of the most dangerous, high-stress roles in the trenches. And here lies another profound paradox. The most brutal dictator in history was a decorated soldier known for his loyalty and bravery, yet he never rose above the rank of corporal. He was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, in 1914. He was wounded by shrapnel at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. He received the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, an extremely rare decoration for a corporal. Hitler loved the war. It gave his life structure, fraternity, and a noble national purpose. The trenches became his true home and his university of practical politics. When Germany signed the armistice in November 1918, Hitler was in a military hospital in Pasewalk, recovering from temporary blindness caused by a British mustard gas attack. The news of the defeat, the stab in the back by alleged internal enemies, Jews, Marxists, and liberals, hit him like a physical blow. In his mind, the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by traitors at home. The trauma of the defeat, combined with the extreme nationalism and anti-Semitism he cultivated in Vienna, forged his new singular identity. He left the hospital, a man consumed by a messianic conviction. Germany must be avenged, and its internal enemies must be purged. The corporal had found his mission.
The Demagogue's Apprenticeship and the Beer Hall Blitz, 1919 to 1929. The German Workers' Party, from spy to orator. Following the war, Corporal Hitler was effectively an agent of the new German army, tasked with monitoring political unrest and radical groups. This intelligence work led him, in September 1919, to a small political circle meeting in a Munich beer hall, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or German Workers' Party, or DAP. It had barely 40 members and was known for its ultra-nationalist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Hitler's assignment was to observe, but his life was about to take a breathtaking, unexpected turn. During a discussion, one speaker proposed Bavarian separatism. Hitler, a firebrand of German nationalism, stood up and delivered an impromptu, furious tirade against the idea. His voice, hoarse from the gas attack, but filled with a searing magnetic conviction, stunned the room.
The party's founder, Anton Drexler, was immediately impressed. This moment was the true birth of the future dictator. Hitler discovered his singular, terrifying talent, oratory. He was a master of the populist moment. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke for their deep-seated grievances, their collective sense of humiliation after the Treaty of Versailles. His rallies were not political meetings, but carefully staged theatrical performances. He would often arrive late, build up the suspense, and then unleash a volcanic, mesmerizing wave of rage and promise. He promised to restore German pride, crush the November criminals who had signed the armistice, and provide a scapegoat for every woe: the Jews, the Marxists, the international financiers. By 1920, he had taken over the party's propaganda, designed its now infamous swastika flag, a potent, aggressive symbol replacing the party's previous mild logo, and renamed it the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or Nazi Party. By 1921, he had become its undisputed Führer. The small club of 40 was now a burgeoning mass movement. The 1923 coup, failure, and the literary legacy. The nascent Nazi Party quickly built up a paramilitary arm, the Sturmabteilung, or stormtroopers, composed largely of disillusioned, violent ex-soldiers. By 1923, with economic chaos and hyperinflation gripping Germany, Hitler decided the time was ripe for a dramatic power grab. On November 8, 1923, he launched the Beer Hall Putsch, an amateurish, deeply arrogant attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government, a prelude to seizing power in Berlin. Hitler and his SA men, along with World War I General Erich Ludendorff, stormed a large Munich beer hall where state officials were holding a meeting.
The coup was an unmitigated disaster. The following day, as Hitler and his men marched toward the city center, they were met by police. A brief gun battle ensued. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was pulled to the ground, dislocating his shoulder, and later arrested for high treason. He was tried in 1924. The trial, however, became the ultimate unintended propaganda vehicle. The weak, conservative judges allowed him to turn the courtroom into a political stage. He spoke for hours, transforming his act of treason into an act of patriotic martyrdom. Instead of fading into obscurity, Hitler became a national figurehead for the extreme right. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. He served only 9 months. This imprisonment, the result of a catastrophic political failure, proved to be one of the most consequential periods of his life. In the relative comfort of his prison cell, waited on by a personal assistant, Hitler dictated his political testament, an autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf was not a political blueprint. It was a sprawling, hate-filled, and self-aggrandizing manifesto of his worldview, his hatred of Jewish Bolshevism, his vision of German Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, and the need for a pure, racially supreme Aryan state. It was a clear, unambiguous warning to the world, yet it was dismissed by many as the ramblings of an embittered fanatic. After his early release, the 400,000 copies of the book that would eventually be sold, making him a millionaire, ensured that his radical ideas, however dense and poorly written, were firmly planted in the public consciousness.
The Ascent to Power and the Night of the Long Knives, 1929 to 1934. The Great Depression, the Golden Opportunity. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 was the catastrophic opportunity Hitler had been patiently waiting for. The Great Depression hit Germany with devastating force. International loans dried up, banks collapsed, and unemployment soared to over 6 million, roughly 30% of the working population. The fragile Weimar Republic, already undermined by political infighting, failed utterly to cope with the economic catastrophe. In the face of hopelessness and national despair, Hitler's simple, radical message resonated. He didn't offer complex economic policy. He offered a narrative of blame, the Jews, the communists, the Versailles Treaty signatories, and a vision of national revival through sheer will and racial purity. His rallies, fueled by mass psychological projection, became the only place where the desperate felt heard and their anger validated. The numbers tell the story. 1928 election, Nazi Party wins 2.6% of the national vote. 1930 election, Nazi Party explodes to 18.3% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag, parliament. Hitler ran for president in 1932 against the 84-year-old World War I hero Paul von Hindenburg. While he lost, he won an astonishing 36.8% of the vote in the second round. The sheer scale of his support could no longer be ignored by the entrenched German political elite. The deal with the devil, Chancellor of Germany. The conservative elite, desperate to maintain power and fearing the rising tide of communism, committed a fatal error. They believed they could use Hitler, the Bohemian corporal, as a puppet, a tool to crush the left and restore a strong authoritarian government. The plan was masterminded by Franz von Papen and negotiated with President Hindenburg. They reasoned that if Hitler was brought into the government, he would be contained and tamed by a cabinet majority of conservative, non-Nazi ministers. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Von Papen, the Vice-Chancellor, famously quipped, "We have hired him." This monumental miscalculation, the belief that an unhinged demagogue, whose entire worldview was laid out in Mein Kampf, could be controlled, is one of the most tragic and astonishing moments in modern history. The conservatives' hubris handed the keys of the German state to a man whose only goal was its total destruction and recreation. The swift dictatorship, burning the republic. Hitler wasted no time. The consolidation of absolute power happened with terrifying speed, all within the existing legal framework of a collapsing democracy. The Reichstag fire, 1933. Less than a month after taking power, the German parliament building burned down. While the truth of the arson remains debated, Hitler and the Nazis immediately blamed it on a Dutch communist. This single event was exploited to the maximum. The Reichstag fire decree. Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign a decree for the protection of people and state, which effectively suspended civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. Thousands of political opponents, communists, social democrats, and union leaders were immediately arrested, often under the guise of protective custody. The foundations of a police state were laid. The Enabling Act, 1933. This was the final devastating blow to German democracy. With the communists now banned and other parties intimidated by the SA stormtroopers surrounding the Reichstag, Hitler pushed through a bill that allowed him, as Chancellor, to enact laws without the consent of Parliament or the President. The vote was 444 in favor to 94 against. This act legally dissolved the legislative function of the Reichstag, effectively turning Hitler's regime into a legal dictatorship. The Weimar Republic was dead. The Night of the Long Knives, 1934. Purging the Old Guard. By 1934, the only remaining threat to Hitler's absolute power came from within his own party, specifically from the SA and its powerful leader, Ernst Röhm. The SA, the street-fighting army that had protected Hitler in the early days, was now a massive, undisciplined force of over 4 million men. Röhm, a coarse revolutionary, advocated for a second revolution to nationalize industries and create a people's army out of the SA, a vision that threatened both the German army, the Reichswehr, and Hitler's alliance with the conservative business elite. Hitler was forced to choose between his old comrade and the military establishment he needed for his expansionist plans. He chose the military. On the night of June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, in a swift, brutal operation known as the Night of the Long Knives, the SS, now loyal only to Hitler and led by Himmler, murdered Röhm and dozens of other SA leaders and political opponents. The purge was carried out with chilling efficiency. It was a clear, unambiguous message. No one, not even Hitler's oldest allies, was safe. It established the SS as the new elite force of terror and crucially secured the allegiance of the German army, which was delighted to see its rival, the SA, eliminated. With the SA crushed, the military appeased, and all democratic institutions dismantled, only one man remained above Hitler, the aged President Hindenburg.
The Führer, the Vision and the End of the World, 1934 to 1945. The Führer, Consolidation of Absolute Power, 1934. On August 2, 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died. Within hours, Hitler, through a prearranged cabinet decision, abolished the office of the president. He merged the offices of Chancellor and President into a new singular title, Führer und Reichskanzler, Leader and Reich Chancellor. The single greatest shock was yet to come. The entire German armed forces, the professional military he had just appeased, were now ordered to swear a new personal oath. I swear by God this sacred oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and will at all times be ready as a brave soldier to stake my life for this oath. This was not an oath to the German Constitution or the German state. It was a personal pledge to one man. This act cemented the final total transformation of the German state into a totalitarian dictatorship and a personal fiefdom ruled by a single, unchecked will. From this moment on, every decision, from major military strategy to the minutiae of racial policy, emanated from the Führer's unique and catastrophic worldview. Racial war and the looming shadow. With total control secured, Hitler moved quickly to formalize his racist ideology into law. In 1935, he enacted the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship. They were now mere subjects of the state. Prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, deemed racial defilement. This systemic legal exclusion paved the way for the coming horror. It created a legal, public justification for the systematic terror that would follow. Parallel to this internal purge, Hitler began the rearmament of Germany, a direct and brazen violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He used massive public works projects, most famously the construction of the Autobahn, highway system, to restore employment, stimulate the economy, and create a powerful sense of national purpose and pride, all with a view toward the grand, singular goal of conquest. He began his geopolitical campaign of aggression. 1936, remilitarization of the Rhineland. 1938, the Anschluss, the forced annexation of his native Austria. 1938, the seizure of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. The Allied powers, paralyzed by the memory of World War I and desperate to avoid another global conflict, repeatedly chose appeasement. They allowed Hitler to break treaties and seize territories, a catastrophic error driven by the belief that he was a rational actor with limited demands. Hitler saw this as confirmation of the decadent weakness of the democracies. His appetite was not satiated, it was merely whetted. World War and the final solution. The ultimate inevitable climax came on September 1, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland, triggering the start of World War II in Europe. The initial phase of the war was of an astonishing German success, a terrifying application of the Blitzkrieg, lightning war tactic. Poland fell quickly, followed by the stunning and rapid defeat of France in 1940. The map of Europe was rewritten in a matter of months. As the war expanded, Hitler's focus turned irrevocably to the east. the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa in 1941, and the final systematic realization of his racial mission, the Holocaust. The sheer, chilling bureaucracy of the genocide is what remains the most astonishing fact. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the army into Eastern Europe, murdering millions of Jews and Slavs by mass shooting. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 established the Endslung, the end solution to the Jewish question, a plan to systematically murder every Jew in Europe using centralized extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, equipped with industrial-scale gas chambers. This was not a spontaneous outburst of wartime violence. It was a state-sponsored, technologically enabled project of total human destruction, unprecedented in its scope and cold bureaucratic precision. Hitler, who was deeply preoccupied with his own health, a vegetarian, a teetotaler, and a non-smoker who loved his dog Blondie, was the single will driving the most barbaric act in human history. The Collapse and the Bunker, 1945. By 1943, the tide of the war had definitively turned. The defeat at Stalingrad, the loss of North Africa, and the Allied invasion of Italy put Germany on the defensive. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, refused to listen to his generals, often interfering with disastrous military orders. His health deteriorated rapidly, with historical accounts suggesting he suffered from Parkinson's disease, visible in his shaking left hand, and was consuming a daily cocktail of 28 different drugs administered by his eccentric personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. The ultimate end came in the ruins of Berlin in April 1945. While the Soviet Red Army fought its way into the city, Hitler retreated into the Führer bunker, an underground claustrophobic complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. In his last days, he was an isolated, paranoid, and raging shell of a man, consumed by betrayal and delusion. In a final act of grotesque theatricality, he married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, on April 29, 1945. Less than 40 hours later, on the afternoon of April 30, 1945, as Soviet shells exploded over the bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide by a combination of cyanide capsule and a gunshot to the head. His and Eva Braun's bodies were immediately carried out into the Chancellery Garden, doused in gasoline and burned by his remaining staff. A final desperate attempt to prevent his remains from falling into the hands of the enemy, mimicking the very tactics he had ordered for countless victims. The story of the mediocre Austrian painter who became the greatest butcher in history is a chilling testament to the power of resentment, the fragility of democracy, and the cosmic terror that a single, unhinged will, fueled by an ideology of hate, can unleash upon the world.